Control is the lifeblood of the narcissistic psyche. When a narcissistic woman invests in a relationship, it is rarely for the sake of genuine intimacy or shared growth. Instead, it is about the subtle architecture of influence, the quiet manipulation of circumstances, and the assurance that she remains the central force in someone else's life. Losing a good man shatters this illusion. Suddenly, the carefully constructed reality she relied upon begins to crumble. The person who once mirrored her desires, accommodated her moods, and reinforced her self-image is no longer bound by her control. And in that absence, an unfamiliar vulnerability emerges, a fear she seldom acknowledges, even to herself. This fear is not merely about the absence of power over another. It is existential. Control provides narcissists with a sense of safety, an anchor in a world that otherwise feels unpredictable and threatening. Without it, they confront a chaos that is deeply unsettling, a chaos that forces them to see life as something beyond their manipulation, beyond their ability to dominate outcomes. There is a profound anxiety in realizing that the world does not bend to one's will, and that no amount of charm or strategy can reclaim what has been lost. The psychological mechanism is simple yet devastating. By controlling others, she controls the narrative of her own identity. When the good man leaves, the narrative fractures. She is forced to acknowledge not just his absence, but the emptiness of the illusion she depended on. The sense of omnipotence, the belief that she could steer hearts and actions, is suddenly revealed as fragile. And here lies the paradox. The very fear that drives her attempts at control is the same fear that becomes impossible to satisfy. She can no longer command what is gone. She can no longer rewrite what was. In that stillness, there is truth, harsh, unyielding, but undeniably real. The question then is not whether she will regain control, but whether she will finally confront the deeper reality she has long avoided, that true power is not in controlling others, but in mastering oneself. When a narcissistic woman loses a good man, the fear that rises is not just about absence, it is about revelation. She has built her life and her relationships on carefully curated illusions. She presents a version of herself that is polished, charming, and compelling, while the deeper, darker corners of her psyche remain hidden from view. But when someone who truly loved her departs, the safety of that concealment begins to crumble. The very person who once reinforced her image, excused her shortcomings, and accepted her manipulation now becomes a silent witness to truths she cannot undo. The fear that her private self, the self she keeps veiled, will be exposed to the world is both visceral and profound. This fear is deeply psychological. It is tied to the fragile architecture of the narcissistic ego, which depends on perception, admiration, and validation. Unlike healthy individuals who can confront their flaws and integrate them into a cohesive sense of self, a narcissist's identity is externalized. It exists in the eyes of others. The moment someone steps away, the ego's foundation shakes. The narrative she has controlled, the image she has carefully maintained, is suddenly vulnerable to scrutiny. Others may see what she hoped would remain hidden: her manipulation, her selfishness, her inability to love unconditionally. The exposure is terrifying because it threatens not only reputation, but existence as she experiences it. For a narcissist, to be seen for what one truly is feels like annihilation, because her sense of worth is inseparable from the illusions she projects. And yet, the paradox is undeniable. The more she clings to concealment, the more visible her fear becomes. The lesson here is both stark and subtle. True security Real strength does not come from hiding or controlling perception. It comes from facing oneself, embracing the parts we fear others will see, and learning to act with integrity, regardless of judgment. In losing someone who truly loved her, she is forced to confront what she has long denied, that authenticity, not illusion, is the only armor that can withstand the test of loss. In the end, exposure is not the enemy. It is the mirror that finally reflects the truth she cannot escape. Regret is a subtle, creeping fear, one that strikes at the very core of the narcissistic experience. A narcissistic woman may appear unshakable, even triumphant, while she manipulates, charms, or distances herself from others. Yet, when she loses a good man, someone who loved her with depth, patience, and authenticity, regret begins to whisper in the spaces she cannot control. Unlike anger or resentment, which she can project outward, regret is internal, inescapable, and intimately connected to the truth she refuses to face. It is the sudden realization that she has sacrificed something irreplaceable for the fleeting satisfaction of ego, vanity, or impulse. Psychologically, regret is the recognition of opportunity lost, the acknowledgement that no future charm, no calculated effort can restore what was given freely and without condition. A good man who understood her, yet demanded nothing but honesty and respect, represents a rare form of human generosity that cannot be replicated through manipulation or control. The narcissist fears that she will never encounter such unwavering commitment again, and this fear gnaws at the ego because it cannot be fixed with strategies, lies, or charm. It is a confrontation with mortality, not of life itself, but of relational possibility. This fear of regret also carries a philosophical weight. It forces her to confront the impermanence of influence, the limits of power, and the consequences of self-centered choices. Every action that contributed to his departure becomes a mirror, reflecting patterns she can no longer ignore. The paradox is cruel. The very traits that once secured temporary satisfaction now ensure lasting emptiness. The world she tried to shape to her cannot provide the solace she craves, and she is left to reckon with the void her decisions have created. Regret, then, is not merely an emotion, it is a teacher. It illuminates what she failed to value, challenges her illusions, and points to a truth she can no longer escape. Love that is genuine and selfless is irreplaceable, and when it is lost, no measure of ego can recover it. The question is no longer what she can control, but whether she will allow this fear of regret to awaken something deeper within, a capacity for awareness, reflection, and transformation. There is a fear more profound than the fear of losing control, more haunting than the fear of exposure, and more subtle than the fear of regret. It is the fear of facing oneself. For a narcissistic woman, the self is not a comfortable companion. It is a reflection she avoids, a space where insecurity, emptiness, and unresolved wounds dwell. She has built her identity on outward appearances, manipulation, and the validation of others. Her energy is consumed with projecting strength, charm, and superiority, leaving little room to examine the cracks within. But when a D-man leaves, someone who loved deeply and demanded authenticity, she is confronted with a silence she cannot escape. In that silence, the self she has long denied becomes unavoidable. Psychologically, this confrontation is terrifying because it threatens the very structure of her defenses. Narcissism, in essence, is a shield against the truth of one's vulnerability. By constantly looking outward, controlling, charming, or manipulating, she avoids the inward gaze that might reveal inadequacy, shame, or emptiness. Yet the departure of someone who truly loved her strips away distractions. There is no longer a mirror reflecting her preferred image. There is only herself, and facing that self is to see not just what she has done, but what she is. Philosophically, this moment carries immense significance. It forces an encounter with the raw, unmediated truth of existence. That identity cannot be sustained by external validation alone, and that the soul must eventually reckon with its own shadow. The narcissistic woman may resist, deny, or deflect, but the fear persists because the self, when ignored, grows louder. It demands attention, reflection, and ultimately transformation. The irony is profound. She has spent a lifetime evading this confrontation, yet it is the very loss of genuine love that creates the opportunity to meet herself. In facing her own reflection, she is forced to recognize the patterns she has repeated, the harm she has caused, and the emptiness she has cultivated. True courage, then, is not in controlling others or hiding flaws, but in daring to look inward, to face the parts we fear, and to allow that reflection to guide change. For it is only in facing herself that she can hope to understand the consequences of her actions and perhaps, finally, grow. Beyond control, exposure, regret, and self-confrontation, there lies a more insidious fear, the fear of irrelevance. For a narcissistic woman, significance is not merely a desire, it is a necessity. Her sense of identity and worth is inextricably tied to the impact she has on others, the attention she commands, and the admiration she elicits. When a good man leaves, he takes with him a part of that influence, a reflection of her importance in the world she has constructed. Suddenly, she is confronted with the possibility that her presence may no longer matter, that the echoes of her charm, her manipulation, and her carefully curated persona may fade into silence. This fear is profoundly existential. It is not simply the absence of attention, it is the erosion of the narrative that sustains her sense of self. In losing someone who truly valued her, she faces the stark realization that her power to shape perception has limits, that the world does not revolve around her desires, and that relationships are not permanent playgrounds for ego. The influence she relied upon to validate her identity is gone, and with it comes an anxiety she cannot charm, manipulate, or control away. Philosophically, this moment challenges the very foundation of her being. Narcissism thrives on reflection. The affirmation she receives from others is what constructs the image she presents to the world. When those mirrors vanish, she is forced to confront emptiness, not just around her, but within her. The fear of irrelevance is ultimately the fear of being truly seen, not as the persona she projects, but as a being whose essence cannot command the loyalty, love, or attention she once assumed was hers by right. And yet, in this fear lies a hidden opportunity. The loss of external validation exposes the illusion of significance, built on others' perception, and opens a path toward understanding that true worth is internal. Relevance is not conferred by control, charm, or manipulation. It is discovery, deep through authenticity, reflection, and alignment with one's own conscience. The lesson is clear. If she cannot influence the world, she must learn to influence herself, for only through inner substance can any presence endure beyond the fragile gaze of others. Beyond control, exposure, regret, self-confrontation, and the fear of irrelevance, there is a final fear that reaches the deepest layers of the narcissistic psyche, the fear of emotional consequences. Narcissism often shields itself with charm, deflection, and manipulation, creating a protective barrier between the self and genuine feeling. But when a good man leaves, someone who loved her authentically, without conditions, the emotional repercussions of her actions become unavoidable. There is no longer a buffer, no sympathetic echo to absorb the weight of what has been lost. The feelings she has long ignored or suppressed now surge, and with them comes a terror that cannot be negotiated or controlled. Psychologically, this fear is profound because it confronts her with the reality of cause and effect in human relationships. Every slight, every manipulation, every moment of selfishness she justified in her own mind returns as an undeniable truth. Love is not a commodity to be taken lightly, And emotional harm is never without consequence. The narcissist is forced to reckon not only with the pain she has caused another, but with the emptiness that follows when someone capable of true love is no longer present. Loneliness, guilt, that deep inside, and the haunting knowledge that she may never encounter such depth again, combine into a psychological weight that can no longer be deflected by charm or distraction. Philosophically, this fear is a confrontation with reality itself. Life is not a game to be played with others' emotions. It is a network of interconnections, each carrying responsibility and consequence. The narcissistic one, Omen, in her habitual avoidance of accountability, faces a reckoning that emotional consequences are inevitable, and that the heart she once held in her hands has now withdrawn its consent to be her mirror, her servant, or her validation. And yet, in this fear lies potential. The acknowledgement of emotional consequences is not merely punishment. It is a doorway to awareness. It is an invitation to recognize the human cost of actions, to cultivate empathy, and to learn that the quality of one's relationships is inseparable from the quality of one's conscience. The truth is undeniable. To evade emotional consequences is impossible, but to face them is the first step toward transformation, integrity, and the possibility of truly meaningful connection.